G'day guys, this is another gear video in my little series here about eating ruddy fallow bucks. This video is looking at the gear that I use at home to process the venison, get it into my freezer, and then also I guess what I would call essential cooking bits of equipment. So the lists aren't extensive by any means, it's very much what I would consider to be close to the bare minimum if you are looking at processing game meat at home and making some meals to get the most out of that game meat. But please don't think that you need to spend a lot of money to process game meat at home, and don't think that if you don't have some of the items I have here, you're not going to be able to do a good job. You can really get away with not much at all and do a really good job at this stuff. It's more about your knowledge and the techniques you might use to process or cook. If this is the first video you've seen me talking about this series about eating ruddy fallow bucks, then click the link above me here or check the description below and you'll see some links to other videos about what the rut is, hunting the rut, processing game in the field, and some gear that I use to do that. We'll start by talking about some of the gear you absolutely cannot do without. The first being a good boning knife. Now, there are stacks of different kinds out there in terms of the brands and blade profiles, and they all do a fantastic job for the most part. They're also fairly affordable. So I've bought stacks of these over the years and I've got them all over the place in my house. And I've come to find that I like a 5-inch knife a little bit more than a 6-inch knife, but I'd be happy to use any of these ones here or any of the other commercial styles available. This Messermeister is one of my oldest knives, and it started out life looking very similar to this Victory knife here. So you can see just over the years of use and sharpening, the blade has actually been worn down, but it's still perfectly serviceable. It's one of my favorite knives to use. This one here is made by my friend Kevin at Smoking Gauchos. I mentioned him on one of my other videos already. It doesn't necessarily perform any better than these other cheaper knives here. It's just something that looks really, really nice and maybe instills a little bit more pride of ownership and makes me feel cool when I'm using it in the kitchen. But you can see there's not much difference in the way that blade shape is between the Smoking Gauchos knife and this Victory one. They all do pretty well the same kind of job. This one also comes with a leather sheath, which is pretty cool. Besides your knives, a good cutting board is something good to invest in. My brother made this one. His Instagram is called Chip Smithy. There's a link below in my description if you want to have a bit of a look at that. But we also use plenty of these kind of things in our kitchen as well. Most people would have some kind of cutting board at home. Good butcher steels are something you should think about as well. This one here is made by Cambrian. It's a smooth one. There are lots of different kinds out there. This one obviously won't necessarily sharpen your blade. It's more just to maintain a really sharp edge and hone that edge, being a smooth one. So it's pretty important you have a good edge on your knife before you try and use this one. This one here is made by Lansky. They make a whole bunch of different sharpening equipment. It's actually a diamond coated steel. Some people turn their nose up at this kind of steel because they don't like the idea of metal being removed and a knife actually being sharpened on something like this in the middle of processing, but I use it all the time. When I say this will remove metal, it brings me back to this knife here and how the blade has actually shrunk a bit this way just through years of sharpening it. It actually does wear the blade down, but I've had this knife for close to 10 years and it's been through at least a couple of hundred game animals and domestic animals, maybe more, and there's still plenty of life left. So we're not talking about a big investment in money to get a significant amount of time out of this gear. I hesitate to say having a mincer is essential because some of the decent ones can be pretty pricey, but I certainly would not want to be without a mincer in my home when it comes to processing wild game or domestic animals for that matter. My wife and I had a cheaper one I bought off eBay for a couple of years and we ended up blowing it up. It just didn't have the power that we needed it to, And on top of being a bit weak, it was really noisy. This one here, we can have a conversation while this one's going pretty easy. So it's nice and quiet. You can see the brand here, Mephi or Mepha. I can't remember where we bought it. It probably cost us maybe $500 or $600. You may not need to spend that much money now because there are more shops kind of coming out with home butcher hunter style equipment. My Slice of Life in Wangaratta is a really good one to have a look at. It's a fairly heavy duty unit for home use. This unit here weighs 27 kilos, comes with a couple of different grind size plates so you can have a more coarse or a more fine grind if you want to. The cool thing about a mincer is it doesn't matter what you put in there, it all comes out essentially being the same. You could put the youngest deer ever and the oldest deer ever through this, and besides maybe some differences in flavour, you're going to be able to do exactly the same thing with both of those different kinds of ground meat. It's worth noting that some people think grinding a lot of stuff is maybe a bit of a waste because they like to be creative with some of the different cuts that are on the animal. But for me, I don't know why people would argue that. Like, it's not a waste if you are taking meat out of the bush, putting it through the mincer and then using it to feed your friends and family. And mince is incredibly versatile, as we know. Rissoles, spaghetti bolognese, hamburgers, lasagnas, savory mince, it's all good stuff. So if you haven't got a good mincer, try and invest in one. I wouldn't say vacuum sealers are essential because before we bought one, we were just using Glad wrap and Ziploc bags and we did okay. But ever since we got a vacuum sealer, everything's been much neater. It tends to last a bit longer in the freezer and yeah, it just makes life easier. This one here is by Proline. Couldn't tell you how old it is. I couldn't tell you how much we paid for it. I couldn't tell you where we bought it. Similar to what I mentioned with the mincer, if you can afford something which is half decent and maybe has a little bit more power, a bit more grunt, then definitely do that. If you're using something like this for hours on end, they do get a little bit warm, and some of those much smaller, cheaper units have malfunctioned when my mates have been using them. So when we made the decision to buy one, we got something that was pretty decent and we haven't regretted it at all. I won't spend ages on this stuff, guys, but I just wanted to point out to you that besides a couple of stainless steel saucepans that we have for boiling up some coffee or making gravy or boiling up some vegetables, these pots and pans here are what we use the most in the kitchen. These two are both cast iron, but this one's obviously got a raw finish and this one's got the enamel finish, and we use them a fair bit. This wok is carbon steel, this skillet is carbon steel, and this here is a cast iron pan that I bought at a camping shop years ago. It wasn't even that expensive. And the point I wanted to make here is carbon steel and cast iron can be every bit as non-stick as a very good quality non-stick pan. But I've had good non-stick pans in the past and the finish has started to break down on them and you get that black stuff in your food and you have to throw them out and buy new ones. So since I've moved to having this kind of old school stuff, I've enjoyed my cooking much more, and with a little bit of maintenance, they perform really well. So I might do some videos about that kind of stuff here in the future. I think it's a fair assumption that most people have a slow cooker in their kitchen already. We had an older one and it died, and for a little while there I was using that enamel cast iron pot in the oven as a slow cooker. I still like to do that from time to time, but we bought this crock pot here to replace our slow cooker. One, because it's a good slow cooker, but two, because it's also a pressure cooker. It comes with this lid here with this release valve so you can pressure cook with it as well. I think this cost us about $200, like Australian dollars, a year or two ago, and we have not looked back. Besides working like any other slow cooker, the pressure cook function has been something I've enjoyed a lot because I can essentially achieve what I want to with a slow cook, but I can get it done in much less time. So I've pressure cooked entire fallow buck necks in here for maybe an hour and a half and it's come out perfectly tender. Or I've pressure cooked chunks of rear leg muscle meat to make a stew, and that's come out tender in about an hour as opposed to 4 hours or 8 hours or whatever. So if you haven't got a slow cooker, try and get one. And if not, then just use a pot in your oven if you've got a good one. Having said all that though, if you're in the market for a new slow cooker, try and find one of these that does the pressure cooking as well, because that's something that's really helped us get the most out of our wild game very quickly. A decent cook's knife or chef's knife is definitely something you should think about investing in if you don't have one already. That doesn't mean you need to spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars. Like I mentioned with the butcher knives, you can buy a cook's knife or a chef's knife by F-Dick or Victorinox for, I don't know, they're probably less than $100, and they will do a fantastic job. Certainly a much better job than something you buy that's hanging up in the plastic packaging in your local supermarket, which plenty of people have in their houses. This here is a global. It's one of the more affordable, higher end kitchen knives. I've had this one since my 21st birthday, and I'm a few weeks off turning 37. And you can see it's still pretty well as good as new. I've used it extensively, does a great job. This one here is a Providor made by my friend Jason at Seeker Knives. It's an exceptionally high-end knife. I mentioned Jason's knives in my last video about the field equipment because I use his hunting knives. The handle is kind of similar to some of his hunting knives actually, which is really cool. It's a little bit shorter than other cook's knives. It's more of a utility knife, so it's a little bit more maneuverable in some ways, but it's been my workhorse since I got it, and it's just a fantastic bit of equipment. This one is another knife by Smoke and Gauchos, which I've mentioned in the last couple of videos as well. It's a little bit bigger, so maybe it's a bit better for some of the vegetable kind of work, but they all do about the same job. The point is, guys, if you're somebody who's got a couple of really cheap, blunt cook's knives in your kitchen drawer or in your knife block, get something half decent and maintain it, and you will enjoy cooking so much more. Last but not least, guys, is a sous vide machine. S-O-U-S-V-I-D-E. Google it if you've never heard of it before, because you don't need me to tell you the science behind it and whatever. This is one from Aldi, so it really wasn't that expensive. I wouldn't say it's essential by any means, but it's really helped me out in the last maybe year or two since I've owned it. Firstly, in a non-conventional sense, it's really good to help with maybe defrosting something quickly if you forgot to get something out of the freezer before you went to work, and it does a much better job of defrosting things than maybe putting something in the microwave. But obviously the main deal with a sous vide machine is getting whatever you're cooking up to a particular temperature and leaving it there as long as you need to. It's not like a slow cooker though. It's not necessarily slow cooking things. It's just about maintaining that kind of temperature. So a traditional method to use this would be to just get a big pot of water. You place this in here and you turn it on and you set it to whichever temperature you'd maybe like your steaks to be in the middle when they're done cooking. And once they've been in there for a couple of hours and they're pretty well cooked, but they're still kind of rare, you take them out, you season them, you put them in a pan to get that sear on them, and you're good to go. So it's kind of like a cooking technique called reverse sear, I guess, but there's less mucking around and guesswork with the oven, and the machine here does everything in terms of maintaining that temperature. If you haven't got one, look at getting one. Like anything, you can spend a heap of money or not much money. This one's done us really, really well in the time that we've had it. That pretty well covers the basic stuff I use in my kitchen to process and then cook the wild game, guys. I have a heap of other stuff like saws and cleavers and other specific pans and knives for different purposes, but I figured I'd keep this video here fairly basic because we could just go on and on about different bits of gear if I wanted to, and I don't know if it'd be useful in this particular video. So maybe in the future, if I do some stuff in much more detail about cooking and cooking techniques and whatever, we might cover a heap of this stuff in a lot more detail. It just depends what you guys might want to see. Keep in mind though, the next video in this series is going to cover a bit about cooking methods with some of the wild game, so it won't be specific step-by-step things to follow for recipes, and more about the ways I use some of these bits of equipment that we've spoken about today to get the most out of wild game. So if you're keen to see that, then hit the subscribe button below. But if you don't subscribe or you couldn't be bothered doing that kind of thing, that's fine too. Just keep an eye out on the socials where you saw this video drop, and you'll see the next one pop up about the cooking methods. Until then, have a good one, and we'll see you later.